here we are, another show with General Welfare Presents. Today is the 17th of September, and my name is Paul Glumaz, and we are entering quite a period, I might add. We have a rapidly emerging new paradigm in the world, and we have a very dangerously collapsing empire. Pretty much a British empire, but it has American characteristics. So, to give you a sense of this, there was a conference in Xi'an, which is like the jumping off point for the old Silk Road and also for the new Belt and Road in China. It was the Euro-Asian dialogue, economic dialogue. And among the panels, there was a think tank panel, and Helga LaRouche did the keynote on that panel. And on another panel, our friend in Italy, Nino Galloni, got a discussion at the conference on a new Bretton Woods and on moving the more industrialized, older industrialized countries into a discussion on energy flux density. That is, moving these industrial nations into the much more advanced energy flux density technologies, and as well as bringing to places like Africa the development like the Transaqua. And there was a huge discussion on the Bretton Woods, on what kind of new architecture. And this is very important. This was a major conference with 50 nations in attendance. And so the combination of Helga and Jacques Cheminade, our presidential candidate, the presidential candidate of the Solidarité and Progress in France, were there, and those three were representing Europe, and they were representing, and so this is how things are moving forward. And as these things move forward, you have tremendous collaboration going on between Russia and China and Russia and India, and the integration of the Eurasian Economic Union with the Belt and Road, and you have all these massive developments. But perhaps the biggest development of all, one of the biggest developments of all, is that the president of France, in a presentation to his diplomats back in late August, the 27th, laid out to the diplomats that the end of Western hegemony has come. That we have a new world emerging that is based on long-time civilizations, Chinese civilizations, Indian civilizations, and to some degree Russian civilization, which is 1,000 years old. And what people have to understand is that Putin is representing not just Russia. He's representing a civilization, a traditional civilization, an orthodox civilization. And India is representing not whatever people think India is, but the thousands of years of traditions that comes out of the Sanskrit derived culture. You have to understand that India has been under the British yoke since the middle 1700s. So India has been under the yoke for almost, well, at least 350 years, if not longer. About 350 years. And even though they became independent and separated into two, Pakistan and India, they have nonetheless been under, they have never really emerged until now. They have emerged. India has now emerged. They put a lander on the moon. Yes, they lost contact with it, but they put a lander on the moon. That's not something an underdeveloped country does. they have emerged, and Modi is now and India are now a big player in the world, and Putin made it very clear when there was a discussion of bringing Russia back onto the G7, making it the G8. Putin made it very clear that that wouldn't do anything, that you have to bring China and India. If you don't bring China and India in, it's meaningless, because they're emerging. And as they emerge, it's a huge development. Now, in that context, Putin is doing a lot of diplomacy, and Trump is somewhat sympathetic to what Putin is doing, because Trump wants to end all these wars. He really does. But his entire administration and the leadership of both parties, they want to continue these wars, because they want to maintain the imperial hegemony over the world, which is totally reliant now on U.S. military power projection. And the Saudis are starting to hedge. The Israelis are starting to hedge, since the failure of the terrorism to take over the area. So Putin is trying to create with China a stable Middle East, and they're willing to have the U.S. play a major role in that as part of that. And Trump is sympathetic to that. So what that means is that the control over the Middle East will shift from the empire more to the parties that involved, and there is a tendency in Saudi Arabia to try to modernize Saudi Arabia. It's partly represented in the new prince, the prince that is, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and you see it also in his cousin, his in Abu Dhabi. The point is that as this process develops, as the U.S. tries to pull out of Syria and Afghanistan, the empire is saying, well, what the hell? Why don't we blow this thing up? Why don't we just blow this thing up? So you had these, the attack on these oil refineries in Saudi Arabia. Nobody really knows who did it. The Houthis are claiming it from Yemen, but there are many other possibilities. And immediately, Iran is blamed by Pompeo. And Lindsey Graham says, we weren't hard on them earlier, so now they're doing this, and now we have to move and blow up their oil refining capability. So you blow up Saudi Arabia's oil refining capability, you blow up Iranians' oil capability. Well, who depends on their oil? China and India, and to some degree Japan and Southeast Asia. Okay, is that what you want to do? Is that the purpose of all of this? Is to blow the place up and screw up these Asian countries which are coming into their own? That's a good question. Now, you have the same thing going on in Hong Kong. What is going on in Hong Kong is being run by the criminal financial element in Hong Kong that the Chinese government has been trying to clean up. And what is it all about? Well, Hong Kong is not in the best shape because they've been under the British system, as opposed to China, where every year there's an increase in the living standard of the population. So what the Chinese are saying to the young people that are rioting is saying, don't look west, look north. Look how things are developing in the north. Why? Look to us. That's how you're going to have a future. So this whole thing, besides it being a color revolution and all of that, is designed to be played back throughout the overseas Chinese community around the country, around the world, and then played back into the U.S. as, demonizing China And now the FBI is going around starting to arrest and harass Chinese students and Chinese scholars, and like they did during the McCarthy period. They're starting that whole process. And have you ever known anybody who knew somebody that was from China that may or may not have worked with somebody who may have or may have not worked with the Communist Party of China? I mean, that's the kind of thing you're starting to get going here in the U.S. And you have hundreds of thousands of Chinese students and Chinese scholars, and this is also where they're recruiting people to go after. And certain organizations are being highly promoted, like the Falun Gong, which is a cult, and they're being highly financed and promoted, and they're pretending to be the friends of Donald Trump, and so forth and so on. And then the other big player in all of this is Steve Bannon, who's comparing what the Chinese are doing to the British East India Company, the end of our empire, and they're going to take over, and the Chinks are going to run the world, and you don't want that. We have to fight. Well, it turns out that he was exploiting cheap labor in Hong Kong, and that's one of the ways he made his millions. Back when he was also with Goldman Sachs. So this is a very nasty bunch of people that want to get a confrontation, want to get a crisis going between the U.S. and China. Now, the empire is going under, and the French president, Macron, who is a Rothschild, what is a Rothschild asset? And this is a good question about the Rothschilds. Nonetheless, to the diplomats, he said, Western hegemony is over. We enter a new era, and we must look to that for France's future, for the future of Europe. We must look to Russia and China and the East for the future of Europe. This is huge. The president of France, of course, he's sort of showing, he's moving into the leadership position of Europe in the context of the situation in Great Britain and the total collapse of sanity in the political process of Germany. There's no real government in Germany right now. It's a caretaker government. It's a minority caretaker government which is committing self-suicide by shutting down first its nuclear power and then its oil and coal and other. So France, which is a nuclear power country, 70% of their energy comes from nuclear power, and France is now starting to feel the idea that maybe it's their turn to be the dominant force in Europe. So this is why Macron is doing this. Meanwhile, there's a shambles in Great Britain in the Parliament over the Brexit, and there's potentially a similar shambles emerging in Canada after the 21st of October election. And the reason why is the following. The United Kingdom and Canada and Australia, New Zealand in particular, and there's other smaller countries, islands and what have you, their sovereign is the Crown, the British Crown. The British Crown is sovereign over the financial system of the City of London and the offshore. The Crown is sovereign over the British intelligence, MI5, MI6. Oh, that's the intelligence community. The sovereign is not public, but it's still sovereign, and it can dismiss any government if it so chooses, because it's sovereign. And the Crown also sets the long-term policy, not directly through the Parliament, but through the private sector, through think tanks, through the media, through the networks that they control, through the offshore financial system. And the long-term policy of the Crown is to push the green agenda, the depopulation agenda, the world's overpopulated, the neo-Malthusian agenda. Now, as they promote that agenda, they come into conflict with the populations that are under their control, because of the effects that these policies have on the average person. You know, so becoming a post-industrial society, all this immigration is coming in to make up for the lack of, you know, the bearing of children, and for cheap labor, and the refugees and all of that. So you have this, you have government, but still you have a government. You have to govern. And that's not the role of the crown. The crown is not there to govern the society. They're there to set the long-term agenda. They're the sovereign. The government is elected by the people, and it's in the parliament. And in order to be a cabinet member, you have to be elected to the parliament. So there's a political parties and there's coalitions, and these parties have an internal discipline. That is the policy of the party. And if it's a majority government, it sets the policy. But in every parliamentarian has to follow it, unless they break off and become independent. So what's happening is that the population responded to the issue of the European Union by voting up the Brexit. But that precipitated a crisis of government, because the policy of the crown is to keep the financial system going, and the financial system has, if you completely couple the Britain from the European Union, then that's the end of the relationship between the City of London's influence and control over Europe. And there's also a lot of derivatives have to be unwound, and it could cause a total global financial crisis. On the other hand, being under the European Union means you have to follow the European Union, and that's not good either. So there is this crisis in the government, and right now the parliament and I think is on prorogued or has been suspended till sometime in October. And so you don't have a functioning government at this point. You don't have the parties are splitting up. There's parts of the Conservative Party are going to vote with the Labour, and so on and so forth, and it's a complete chaos. And it's a complete chaos because there is no constitution. There is no rule, established constitution. There is no rule to follow. But that was set up that way to give the monarchy more power, but a hidden power, not directly involved in the government. So there is a hemorrhaging of the constitutional right. In Australia, there's a very strong movement for Australian independence from the monarchy. There has always been a strong move to get Australia out of the control of the crown in order to be able to do what it is that it needs to do for itself. When they had a Labour Prime Minister in 1974 who was very committed to the development of Australia and was about to work all kinds of deals with countries in Asia and so forth and so on, this was not the crown. The crown just had him dismissed through the Governor General. In other words, the duly elected person that represents the people of Australia was removed by the crown because he had a policy of Whitlam was his name. He had a policy of development. So you have the same situation coming up in Canada. You have an election, and there's a crisis in Canada with the United States. There's a crisis in Canada with China. There's an economic crisis developing in Canada. There's an inability to develop Canada, and then they're going totally all major parties are going off on the green thing. Okay, so this is an example of a situation in which there's tremendous turmoil about to break out in Canada. Okay, now what does that mean? Well, we'll find out after the federal elections, which comes on the 21st in Canada. So there could be a hung government. There could be neither party having a majority and having to rely on the Greens or the Parti Québécois for the government, which means more chaos. And there's another party running, which is just getting underway, called the People's Party of Canada, the PPC, and they seem to be the only rational ones. But they're just getting started and not being covered or anything like that. So that's and what they want is more of a Canadian nation able to develop Canada, not be and they're the only ones that are actually calling out the climate change fraud that is the basis of the climate change mobilization. Now, the situation in the U.S. in this respect to the collapsing empire is not that at this point the establishment, the global establishment that's out to remove Trump, believes that they can defeat him in the election. It's not about that per se. But they just want to create massive chaos. And what they've done is they've turned the Democratic Party into a psychotic mob. And along with that, Blasio in New York City announced that they're going to allow any student that wants to go to the demonstrations to go out in the street and make mayhem to be allowed to do so, to get a pass. And we're talking about 1.1 million students, most of whom will probably play hooky, but that could bring in quite a significant number of these. So this is the mayor of New York, and this is causing this is turning heads in New York. This is the demonstration with Greta Thunberg and so forth. So you have the front runner, Joe Biden, was asked about poverty in the South among African Americans, and he gave this most bizarre answer, that they need more recordings or more. It was not. I'm not saying it was a wrong answer. It's just a bizarre answer in this context, and he's not showing that he has the mental capabilities to really function as a candidate or even as a president. I mean, it's very demonstrable. Yet he's the front runner. So it's in that context that Modi is making his visit to a triumphant visit to the United States after the space thing. And they have the stadium, Rice Stadium, with 60,000 people in Houston booked, oversold, tickets oversold. And the individual who will be joining him at the stadium is none other than our president, Donald Trump. So you have Modi and Trump together, where all the Indians are flying, all the Indian population is flying in. Houston is the biggest, has the largest Indian diaspora. They're all flying in, and this is India's emergence as a power, as a world power. And here's President Donald Trump endorsing India's emergence as a world power and sharing in the glory. So this is a very different world. So he has a very different point of view. So now we come to the big issue, which is the firing of John Bolton. And the policy groupthink of the entire administration, of the entire Beltway, of most of the military, most of the intelligence community, definitely most of the functionaries. They go in and out of the corporate structure. So it's the international corporations, it's all of that. This power structure has been running operations against Donald Trump. And one of the operations is they've surrounded him with, people that want to go to war. So he's being misled at every point. So you have Pompeo saying that it was the Iranians for sure that did it. And whenever they say for sure, it means they're not really saying the Iranians did it. They're saying for sure means that they didn't do it. But anyhow, so Trump is saying no, the evidence is not there, and he's not moving. He's not moving to bomb Iran. Well, if you move to bomb Iran, that's the end of the whole Middle East area. The Iranians are well armed. They can blow up every Saudi oil field, which is what they said they're going to do. And probably that's what people like Bolton want. That's probably what people like Pompeo want. I mean, Pompeo is a end times religious nut. So this is great. This is the end times, right? You blow up all of Saudi oil fields. You blow up all of this precipitates a nuclear war, and and the rapture is right up ahead. This is really great. This is what we want. That's where Pompeo's coming from. He is our Secretary of State. He is waiting for the rapture. So so this is not the best situation for diplomacy. Is to have somebody waiting for the rapture as your Secretary of State. So as we move forward here, we have had the LaRouche movement had last week had a series of days of actions. We went onto the campuses and confronted this whole green stuff, and we found that we could actually confront the youth on these campuses and begin to create, a rational relationship in the discussion, because there's no reason in what they're getting. They're just getting talking points and fraud. So this is where we are. It's a very dangerous situation. It's a very, very dangerous situation. Everything's possible. But when an empire goes down, they want to take everybody down with them. And that's the problem. And we don't want to go down with the empire. So whatever the situation is, whether it's the situation in Europe or the situation in the Middle East, all of those people, all of those nations, all of those factions that don't want to go down with the empire, they need to work out agreements with each other. And the ultimate agreement is the four-power agreement between the United States, China, U.S., and Russia over a new financial architecture, a new Bretton Woods. But the only way out of Armageddon-like conditions that the empire will bring upon us, if you do not work out some alternative or some new paradigm, that's the reality. That's the reality we face.
Common stock investments have helped to make our country prosperous and powerful. Owning a share in American industry is like owning a share in the future of our nation. But remember, John Q., there is a risk as well as an advantage in owning any kind of property. So get the facts before you put your money to work.